afternoon, everyone. It's Tony Consul from Geneva, Head of Communications at IATA. Thank you for joining us for this briefing, the latest in the series of weekly briefings on how the COVID-19 crisis is impacting the airline industry. As with previous weeks, I'm joined by Brian Pearce, our Chief Economist, and Alexandre Juniac, our Director General and Chief Executive Officer. We'll start with a short presentation from Brian, followed by a few comments by Alexandre, and then we'll throw it open to questions and answers. And once the call is completed, we'll have the notes up on our website, including a transcript of Alexandre's remarks and a press release. So with that, Brian, can I hand it over to you, please?
Yes, thank you, Tony, and hello, everybody. This updates our impact assessment of 3 weeks ago, where we presented these figures showing at the industry level that we expected for 2020 as a whole, we would have expected a 38% decline in air travel measured by RPKs, which would translate into a loss in excess of $250 billion for passenger revenues alone. Now, that assessment was based on worldwide flights in late March being 65% down on a year earlier. It was also based on the economic forecasts of recession that were available at the time. And then thirdly, it was based on an expectation of travel restrictions being relaxed through the second half of this year, following essentially a 3-month lockdown in the second quarter. Now, we're certainly sticking to that lockdown assumption, but if we look at what's happened to flights worldwide subsequently through to a few days ago, you can see that they've fallen further, in particular in Latin America and Africa, where, like Europe and the Middle East, aside from some cargo flights and some repatriation flights, the industry is more or less grounded. Domestic markets are obviously open in China and still open to some extent in North America, and that gives us a global figure, which is the blue line in the middle, showing that flights are down around about 80% at the moment, compared to that 65% we based our impact assessment on 3 weeks ago. Now, the second change is that economists have become much more pessimistic about the global economy. Our previous impact assessment was based on their end March forecast for global economic growth, which at the time was predicting a recession, but less severe than the global financial crisis. You can see that what's happened now, that economists, and this is a fairly typical forecast, this one by Oxford Economics, shows that the expectations now are for a very severe economic downturn, essentially as much of the world's economy has been grounded effectively by the social distancing requirements. And as you can see, global GDP growth is expected to fall by almost 6%, and that's in the second quarter of this year, which is an extraordinarily deep economic recession. That obviously affects the speed at which air travel will return in the second half of the year, because jobs will be lost, confidence damaged, and incomes reduced. So that's the second factor. Then the third factor is really the assumptions around the relaxation of travel restrictions. I think it's become a little clearer that certainly domestic markets will be the first to reopen, as we've seen in China. But the Chinese experience has also shown that the problem of imported cases mean that opening international travel restrictions is more problematic until we see a solution to the health issues. So in this new impact assessment, we have taken a view that domestic markets will be open first, and then international markets will be opened in a more phased approach. what you can see here is that in passenger number terms, it's domestic markets that matter, and that's obviously important for airports. For airlines, revenues are more dependent on the passenger kilometres flown, and as you can see, domestic represents 1/3 of revenue passenger kilometres. So obviously the slower opening of international borders is more problematic for the airline industry. Now, what we've done in this impact assessment, this is a new piece of analysis where we have worked out what the impact on air travel would be of the recession, the economic recession, if we look at the recession alone. So this is not taking into account the impact of travel restrictions. This is not taking into account the impact of the adverse confidence impacts of COVID-19. This is purely the loss of jobs and incomes. And as you can see, the recession forecast does significantly affect the restart period in the second half of 2020. And as you can see, it would reduce RPK growth to a point in the third quarter because of a delayed effect of the loss of incomes and jobs to something like 8% down on a year ago. And that, just by comparison with the global financial crisis, is twice as deep a downturn. So that's quite an important point about our expectation for the second half of the year. And obviously that slows down the recovery expected in the second half of the year. But if we put that in context of what's happening in total to RPKs and travel, you can see that the impact of the recession is actually dwarfed by the impact of the travel restrictions and the confidence effects. And we're expecting to see RPK growth down in the second quarter of this year more than 80% year on year. So that does mean that there's a large amount of pent-up demand should health and travel restrictions allow it to return to the market. You can see in this chart our approach. What we have done is we've looked in the third quarter at the opening of domestic markets, and remember they represent 1/3 of global RPKs. So that contributes to the upturn you see. We've assumed some opening of international markets, and then some further opening and some rebound in the fourth quarter of this year. So we've essentially got 50% of the pent-up demand for international travel returning, taking into account the impact of the recession. What you can see is that by the fourth quarter of this year, we're still expecting to see RPKs something like 1/3 lower than they were a year ago. If we sort of add that all up for the year as a whole, this is our revised impact assessment for 2020. So, those changes to the current situation, to the recession expected, to the expected phased opening of markets mean that we probably going to see RPKs down almost a half in 2020, down 48%, and a loss of something like $314 billion of revenue, which represents something like 55% loss in revenues. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We'll now turn it over to Alexandre to provide his comments. And then after that, as usual, we'll take questions via the chat function. So, Alexandre, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this regular call. As you see, as Brian underlined, the impact of COVID-19 crisis is continuously evolving and deepening. Figures are increasing, losses, impact on jobs. You remember that last time we said that if airlines lose one job, another 24 disappear somewhere. in the value chain. So you remember that we have estimated that 25 million jobs are at risk. It's also why we continue to ask government to make the viability of airlines a priority. We have seen some success in that respect. In Belgium and Sweden, they have responded with relief measures. We know that several other governments are considering similar steps, but we encourage them, all of them, to move quickly. After the announcement, after the showing a very open attitude, we need now the money to be flown in our balance sheet and P&L through direct financial aid, loans, loan guarantees, support for corporate bonds by governments, guaranteed by governments and purchased by central banks, tax relief, whatever. Second point, Brian has underlined the impact of the restriction on travel has had a major impact on our business. It has led to a major drop in traffic. Of course, it is contributing to the strong fight against COVID-19 pandemic. The point is that it is clear that locking down measures and travel restrictions can be done unilaterally, and have been done in many cases unilaterally. But on the other hand, it's much more difficult to have a similar end of restriction end of travel bans unilaterally. It has to be done on a cooperative and collaboration approach. It's not possible to do that state by state. What is a bit worrisome is when we see some relief measures or some announcements for the end of the reduction in lockdowns in many countries. We do not see many measures regarding air transport. Even in China and South Korea, which have been successful in controlling the disease, we see that they are doubling down on international travel restrictions for a simple reason: they don't want to risk importing a second outbreak. So it is absolutely key now that among the various measures that government are considering, to release some of travel restriction, to reduce lockdowns, or to reopen their countries, it's absolutely key to put air transport in at the center of the reflections and the plans. And that has to be done through various set of measures. First of all, we need to restore passenger confidence. Whether passengers travel for business or for leisure, they need to have their confidence restored. So, and this confidence is with no doubt based on the measures we'll be able to implement to limit the risk of COVID-19 spread during travel or after travel, or the risk of COVID-19 pandemic to have consequences on the travel for passengers, for instance, by imposing quarantine on the part of the travel. This has to be done through a collective and collaborationist approach between government and industry and regulators to see how we will together lift these restrictions. So we have started to display a restart plan that we have been working on. This restart plan will be discussed on a regional approach subcontinent by subcontinent, because we believe that it can be done through a regional approach. So we have set up regional summit, grouping governments with civil aviation, health authorities, ICAO, all the actors of the value chains, airlines, airports, air and navigation providers. So all the actors around the table on a regional basis to see how we will be able to restart our industry in a consistent, comprehensive, and coherent way. The example we have taken, perhaps very ambitious, but I think it's a good reference, is the Chicago Convention. You remember that the Chicago Convention was signed and ICAO was founded by governments in December 1944. At that day, the World War II was not at all finished in Europe or in the Pacific. So it was interesting to see that a group of very advanced and looking forward people were able to meet and to set up the basis of the future air transport, even if the future was totally uncertain and the outcome was not at all, nobody was able to forecast the outcome. So we should do that as they did 75 years ago, and as the airline did 4 months after, in the April 1945, when they founded IATA. So we have, together with governments, with all the actors of the value chain, plan and think and plan the future of the industry, and the restart plan is what we have started to do, and we hope that it will be successful in being able to restart that in an efficient, effective, and safe way for everyone. So we look forward to taking your questions now. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandre. We'll now move to questions, and we have a few already in the queue. So we'll try and go through them in order, one at a time. So first question is, we've seen lots of stories about passenger aircraft being converted for cargo operations. Do we have an estimate as to the extent of that, so the number or the percentage of aircraft that are going through that conversion? And are airlines facing any regulatory hurdles or restrictions in their effort to keep freight moving around the world?
No, we have no precise estimate on that. The interesting point is that we have been able, together with ICAO, to issue some guidelines in 2 days that have been given to all airlines in the world to be able to give them a framework on how to transform a passenger aircraft into a cargo aircraft. So it's guidelines on how to put the goods inside, the weight and the repartition of weight inside the cabin. And they are applicable, and now things are done on a safe and compliant manner all over the world. So we haven't seen so many hurdles in government regulations that have prevented these transformation. Even we have seen many governments implementing cargo plans to facilitate the traffic from all points of view: regulatory, technically, customs, tax, paperwork, etc.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. Also, I guess we should mention that in some cases we're still seeing some restrictions on crew and their ability to operate cargo flights. Would you agree, Alexandre?
Yes, there are some restrictions, but we are advocating a lot with governments to reduce or to lift these restrictions, and successfully governments are progressively, doing whatever they can, to avoid imposing to crews working on cargo aircraft too many constraints, especially in terms of quarantine.
Okay, we have a question for Brian. The question suggests that each time we update, the situation is getting worse, and that's understandable. But are we still being too optimistic with the current forecast of 314 billion lost revenues, especially if travel takes a long time to return?
I hope not. Our analysis can really only be done on the basis of the facts as they stand today, and so that's the approach that we take. Obviously, the future is highly uncertain, and to a large extent, the accuracy of these forecasts, the recovery of air travel and the industry will depend on the success that we and other players have in helping to orchestrate a more coordinated relaxation of travel restrictions.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question on the situation in Israel with respect to refunds to passengers. The consumer organization in Israel is forcing refunds by court case. Does IATA have a comment on that?
No, we usually do not comment on court decisions. The situation in Israel is so we have done in Israel similar things that we have proposed everywhere else, as to propose vouchers instead of immediate refunding, and because we thought that vouchers was a good way to avoid cash drain on our industry and maintaining for passengers the right to fly at a certain date. We have even proposed to the EU to have a choice between vouchers and the refunding. But the refunding would occur not now, but in 6 to 9 months from now. That would have also, give a relief to airlines in terms of cash. So, as in Israel, it has been refused by the court. In the US, the Department of Transportation has also refused that refunding can be done through vouchers. In Europe, we are still in discussion with European authorities to give the choice between vouchers and refunding, late refunding. Some states have accepted, the refunding through vouchers. Colombia, Canada. So the situation is still moving, and we are still pushing this issue, to avoid the airlines, to be totally out of cash, which is the main risk currently.
Okay.
Which would not be a good news for the passengers as well.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question on the opening up of air travel. Do we expect that to happen on a bilateral basis between countries as a result of individual sort of positions on the recovery scale with respect to containing the disease?
It's difficult. It's very difficult to say that now. If we do that on a pure bilateral basis, it will be extremely complicated, extremely long. So it will delay potential recovery and, of course, delay a potential restart of the industry. What we think is that it should probably start with domestic, then immediately be followed by something like be regional, continental, perhaps, and then move to intercontinental, and the quicker the better. That's the approach we have. But it is still to be negotiated, discussed and negotiated with governments.
Okay. We have another question taking reference specifically to Hong Kong, where all inbound travelers are tested for COVID-19. Does what's going on in Hong Kong provide a model for health screening as we move forward?
As we are not specialists, it's difficult, to see if it's a model or not, if it will be accepted and recognized by other states. But it is clear that the conditions, the health control conditions of passengers will be a key element to restart to restart our industry. How will it be done? Through temperature control, through tests, through a serologic test or COVID-19 test? We don't know. We don't know yet. It's a very difficult point, and that will have to be discussed with the health authorities. What we are advocating for is to have similar measures all over the world to avoid a patchwork of complex and different set of measures in different parts of the world. We would like a consistent and a unique set of measures, of control measures.
Okay, thank you. We have a question on cargo. Cargo right now is having an uptick as a result of some of the shipments that are taking place now. Before COVID, the market was shrinking. What do we see as the prognosis or the future for cargo in this context?
Shall I have a quick go at that, Alexander? Yes, we've seen significant demand for cargo. So cargo flights are still going, particularly freighters, and we've heard that passenger aircraft are being converted or used for cargo because of the shortage of capacity. But it's quite a small proportion of airline revenues in the most case. So it's certainly in no way sufficient to make up for the almost complete loss of passenger revenues for many airlines. But it's obviously been critical for transporting medical equipment around the world and also supplying supply chains where they're needed. That role will continue. But I fear that the depth of the recession that is predicted for the second quarter is going to lead to a collapse in demand for products to be shipped, and it's hard to see the air cargo sector escaping that. The World Trade Organization is expecting anything up to a 30% fall in world trade this year, and that's a very difficult environment for cargo.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about aircraft. Before the crisis, airlines were interested in high-density narrow bodies like the 321neo or the 737 MAX 10. Is it possible that after the pandemic, airlines are going to be more interested in the Airbus 319 or 737-7? And what effect do we see the crisis having on existing orders for new aircraft?
The short-haul, short and mid-haul aircraft with high-density configuration was a key element for profitability for airlines, and because it allowed to transport more people on short to mid distances, and so and with a high load factor. So in terms of profitability, it was a key element for many airlines, not only the low cost, but almost everybody. Now, if the question is if there are some distanciation measures that will have to be applied for a certain period of time, of course, it would de-densify, the aircraft. But I do not see the de-densification, having the airlines change their fleet composition from 737 MAX or from 321 through 319 and through 737-700. Because the de-densification, if it is requested by the civil aviation and the health authority, it will be much more than that, as far as we understand. It will be by neutralizing one seat in each row among the two rows of seats. The two rows of seats of a short-haul aircraft. So it's a de-densification of 1/3 of passenger, and that is a complete shift or reshuffle of the business model of many airlines operating short-haul aircraft. So it's a bit technical, my answer, but to tell you that it will not lead the airline to change the fleet composition, but more or less to change the way they operate short-haul aircraft completely, because they will not be able to operate them at more than an 80% load factor. And that is usually 78-75% is the break-even point in the short-haul and mid-haul network.
Okay, thank you. We have a question on the regional summits on the startup plan. When will they take place, and what are the modalities for that?
They are going to take place at the end of this week and beginning of next week. Region by region, or subcontinent, or continent by continent.
Okay, and they'll be done by video conference.
For sure.
Okay.
Otherwise, there will be no summit. Huh?
Yeah. So we have a question also, I guess, expanding on that. What lasting changes do you expect to come to passenger travel because of COVID-19? For example, new cleaning procedures, new boarding processes, de-densification of aircraft, higher fees, etc.
We have identified a series of possible measures. Well, first of all, there are the measures for the passengers to control the passenger, temperature control, test control, all the health control that could be implemented at the departure, but also at the arrival. Well, first of all. Secondly, there are measures that have to be taken by airlines in terms of cleaning or disinfecting the aircraft, which has a major impact on the turnaround time, on social distanciation, so neutralizing some seats, or distributing some equipment, whether it's hydroalcoholic solutions, or masks, or changing the boarding and the disembarking procedures to avoid people to be too close. Also, the waiting rooms and waiting areas to avoid too many people to be grouped in a defined and too small confined area. So there are a lot of practical and logistical measures that we have tried to figure out, and that will be discussed and presented during this summit to civil aviation authorities, to airports, and to, of course, health authorities to see whether or not they are safe and secure.
Okay. We have another question on the restart plan, just asking for more detail on exactly what steps. Do you believe your previous answer, Alexandre, covered that, or in that context, is there something you'd like to add?
The various steps that we can envisage in terms of lifting the barriers, or doing what?
Restarting the industry.
Oh yeah, right. There will be several steps. So probably there will be, first of all, geographical steps. I said domestic, regional, continental, intercontinental. I think that could be. It's not decided, of course, because it depends on government, policies. But it could be a scheme to restart the industry. Then after, we'll have to see how we implement the control measures that will be requested by health authorities. But we should think of them now, because the implementation could first of all be complex, or request some equipment that we will have to be able to provide, or that governments will have to provide. For instance, if they ask for testing, we will have to have millions of tests if we want to test everybody. So it will be a phased approach. It's a bit difficult to tell you how long it will take and what will be exactly the different phases, because it will heavily depend on the measures requested by governments, health authorities, and also by that could restore confidence of passengers into air travel.
Okay, thank you. I'm sort of concentrating on the questions that are concerning restart, so I'm skipping a few, but we'll come back to them. We have a question talking about the de-densification or limits to load factors. What assumptions have we made for this in our forecasts? And if airlines are required to de-densify their aircraft, will airlines need further assistance specifically to offset the cost of this?
So in our forecast, we have not made an explicit assumption. We're really looking at the demand for air travel and the constraints that are put on that by travel restrictions. So the ability of airlines to meet that demand is going to really drive their financial performance. And with a slow return relatively slow return of demand because of a phased relaxation of travel restrictions and also the impact of the recession, that's likely to mean that there's going to be a lot of aircraft around and a smaller market to serve. That will mean that utilization rates will be much lower. Alexandre's talked about the likelihood of lower load factors. That's going to mean unit costs are going to be quite a bit higher for airlines than they would have been in the past.
Okay. We have a question looking, I suppose, into 2021. Do we have any forecast for the industry in 2021? And will we see a drop in RSKs as we're seeing in 2020? What are the changes for this outcome to happen?
So we haven't published any forecasts for 2021 at the moment. Certainly the economic forecasts, given the very substantial fiscal and monetary stimulus, the economists expect 2021 to be a year of strong economic growth. I think that will certainly be helpful for air travel, but I think the extent to which air travel can benefit will be contingent on the success in dealing with the health issues and the extent to which governments have been able to reciprocally open up their borders and international air travel markets. That's obviously what we're working on very hard and will be the focus of the summits that Alexandre has spoken about.
Okay. We have a question on screening. Alexandre, you mentioned temperature screening several times, but with science talking about COVID-19 being carried and transmitted by asymptomatic people, is temperature screening enough, and are there other measures that we should be looking for?
Of course, we have mentioned temperature screening because it has been implemented already and it is applicable in some countries. First of all. Secondly, we are not specialists, and we will follow what the health specialists, the doctors and the professors and the health authorities will request. Especially, we will follow their request if they ask passengers to be tested, or if they think that temperature screening is not enough to prevent the spread of the pandemic. So we will rely on the expertise of the medical authorities to implement the right set of measures. But if you think only about testing, so if we need to test everybody, we will need tens of millions of tests. Just as even hundreds of millions of tests. If we want to test every passenger at departure and the double if we test them at departure and arrival.
Okay. There's a question on domestic and international traffic. Brian talked about the significance of RPKs when looking at the resumption of domestic and international traffic. But what is the picture of the outlook for cargo?
At the moment, cargo flights and cargo capacity is in high demand for transporting medical equipment and supporting the supply chains of a number of industries. I think the challenge for the cargo business is increasingly going to be the impact of the recession once that hits, and I think that's starting to hit now as the economies around the world contract, people lose their jobs, and obviously stop buying product. Longer term, I think the increasing use of e-commerce might mean that the cargo business comes out of this rather stronger because of I think this will there's arguments for this giving a boost to e-commerce, which has been a growing sector, but certainly I think the second half of this year is going to be a difficult one for cargo.
Okay. We have a question about passenger behavior. What do you think will be the bigger concern for travelers when flying resumes? Personal health and safety or economics? For example, having enough money to travel?
Probably both. It's difficult to make a ranking. It depends really on it depends on the passenger and on the motivation for travel.
Okay. Next question is, looking at a market that is restarting, what do we see happening in China, where Wuhan was opened up? And are we seeing, in fact, more flights in the air and more passengers on them?
For the moment, the restart in China happens, slowly. And we are watching very closely the domestic market, which is the only one which has remained active and which should be more active in the coming days/weeks. What we see there is that the level of cancelled flights is still pretty high, and more than 55%, and that the load factor is around 60%. So as a whole, the domestic market, but the evolution is not showing a significant increase in the number of flights or the number of passengers traveling on domestic routes. So for the moment, it is pretty slow.
Okay. We have a question on industry employees. What impact does the current situation have on staff and on airlines? And can we expect retrenchments?
Up to now, the impact of COVID-19 on airline personnel and especially crew has been very limited. Some infections have been detected. Some crew members are treated for COVID-19, but the number up to now has been pretty low, showing that aircraft are not, a place in which the transmission is facilitated or easier. It's even the opposite. Well, so that's for the COVID-19 impact on personnel, and we are taking care of course, and the airlines are taking care very, very, very carefully of their personnel, and of course, everybody will pay attention to the request they might have to come back to work in the same conditions. But that's in our business, it is something that we are used to.
Okay. I think the second part of that question was on levels of employment. Do we see that? I suppose temporarily, for sure, it's going down, but do we see that long term, or do we see it coming back?
Long term, it's a bit difficult. I don't know, Brian, if we have an estimate on that, but I'm sure we don't have. So it's a bit too early yet.
No, I mean we're seeing obviously a lot of staff furloughed from airlines at the moment. with something like 50% cuts in some cases. I mean, as the industry recovers, clearly there will be a need for those staff to return. Yes, but yes, longer term, it really sort of depends on the shape and size of the industry, and obviously there are lots of uncertainties at the moment. It's very hard to say anything definitive about that at the moment.
Okay. There's a question with specific reference to South Africa, where the national carrier is under a business rescue plan. And I guess the question is, how will the COVID-19 crisis add to the difficulties in South Africa, which is already in recession?
That's a bit specialized. It's a bit specialized question. I'm sorry for that, but for the difficulties of South African Airways, they were in a very difficult situation before the COVID. They are now. Apparently, we understand that the South African government will inject some money and will help, the national carrier. Bon. Does the COVID add to the economic difficulties of the country? For sure, as everywhere in the world. Is it more or less than anywhere else? I'm not able to give more precision on that. Brian, I don't know if you are able to do it.
No, I'm afraid not. Beyond to say that aviation is so important for Africa, just because it's difficult to get trade and tourism across a continent where land transport is so difficult. So Africa is certainly a region where we need to see the industry supported for the recovery phase.
Okay. We have a question here which says, analysts have suggested that governments will be selective in which airlines they aid. Their flag carriers will be given advantage. What is IATA's take or perspective on that?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
It's expected, or some analysts are suggesting that governments will provide financial assistance with a preference to the national carriers or the flag carriers. Do we believe that?
It's not true. No, it is not true. There is no general pattern about that. Huh? We see everything different from one country to another. So we cannot say that. There is no preference to anybody. There is usually a preference to the one which is in the most difficult situation, which could be privatized or not.
Okay. We have a technical question. Last week, European airlines were given some relief on air traffic control charges, but there's a June 7th mandate for ADS-B out. Would IATA like to see a delay in that requirement?
Yes, we would like to postpone the date. Yeah, that's absolutely true, because we think it's an additional cost for airlines, and we are not able in this situation to bear any additional costs on our P&L. It's simply impossible for us to pay.
Okay. We have a question on aircraft demand. When do we see aircraft demand coming back? And as a result of the crisis, do we see the potential for passenger to freight conversions increasing in the future?
I'm not sure. No, I'm not sure that we will see a significant increase in transformation from passenger aircraft to cargo, because when the traffic will come back, we will have all the bellies of passenger aircraft being available to transport freight. So normally the capacity should be there. We were more suffering before the crisis. We were more suffering from over capacity in bellies and in cargo full freighters than the opposite. So that's the first point. On the second point, that's the second point. Sorry, the first point was on aircraft demand. For the next 8 to 12 months, we do not see a very strong aircraft demand coming from airlines that have absolutely no cash to buy whatever they would like to or to invest. So for the moment, I think we'll see probably some delays on deliveries and some reshuffle in the order book of the aircraft manufacturers, probably because we will have delays in cancellations.
Okay. We have a question on India. Do we have any ideas to whether the Indian government or indications to whether the Indian government is planning on financial assistance for its carriers? At least two Indian airlines are significantly in a low cash position to survive the pandemic. What's our outlook for India?
So the information we have from India is that the government was considering, to do something for airlines, but we have nothing more precise than that. So it's we are still advocating in favor of rescue package, provided by government to the industry.
Okay. Question on social distancing in airports. We've talked a bit about social distancing on the aircraft, but how do we see that across the various processes of getting the passenger from arrival and the entrance to the airport through to getting on board the aircraft?
But it is clear that we would, in our plan, we have, in our restart plan, we have a big subject about our reorganizing the on-the-ground travel, part of the travel of passengers, and especially, implementing potential social distance requirements inside the airport. So it means, reallocating the waiting spaces, changing the way the queues are organized at the checkpoint, at the security checkpoint, at the border control, at the gate. So yes, it's a big logistical challenge for airports, but we have clearly that in mind. And we are discussing that with the airports, obviously.
Okay. Another question on sort of future employment in the industry. We've projected a pilot shortage for many years now. Has our view on that changed as a result of the coronavirus crisis? And do we still believe that we should be encouraging young people to take up pilot courses and plan on trying to join the industry?
It is clear that the pilot shortage for the coming 12 to 15 months, the pilot shortage is not the main issue that this industry is facing. Yeah? So first of all, but on the long term, if we anticipate that we will come back to normal trends in 18 months to 2 years from now, then we will still have a strong demand for flying, the need for more aircraft, the need for more pilots, and then there will be jobs available for those who want to enter into our industry. But perhaps slightly later than it was expected before.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question on the impact of the crisis on IATA. Have we lost any of our member airlines? And I suppose also, have we seen any impact on our settlement system?
No, we have not lost any members except those who have been bankrupt, which is one or two. And we have not lost any member that would have decided, to quit IATA. One of the reasons for that is that everybody recognized that what we have done in terms of helping the airlines, in terms of advocacy, pushing the governments to put together rescue packages, to have a more open regulatory approach, or reduce our cost has been effective, very effective and very efficient. There's a strong recognition of IATA's actions. The second part of the question was what?
Have we seen any impact on the settlement system?
Yes, of course, on the settlement system, the situation is, of course, very, very tense because you have to manage contradictory interests between various groups of industry participants that have the same cash requirements and opposite cash requirements. But up to now, we have successfully managed the settlement system, but it's a day-to-day, minute-by-minute, work to maintain the settlement system that is a guarantee for our industry to be properly financed, paid, and for the money to circulate properly between the various actors of this industry. So yes, very tense, but we have managed that successfully up to now.
Okay, thank you. And the last question for the day, in looking at the lockdown, can we elaborate on how long we expect the global grounding of air travel to extend for? And are there markets which we think have a greater possibility or probability of opening before others?
The grounding, it's difficult because it will depend on the speed of the recovery and of the restart. What is clear is that at least a partial grounding of the fleet will take place on Q3 and even on Q4, because otherwise it would mean that the demand has come back to the previous levels, which is not likely to happen before Q4 or the end of Q4. I speak under your control, Brian, but it's the figures we have displayed today, and you have commented on today.
Yes, that's correct. We've made the assumption that there'll be a 2 to 3 month period in the second quarter where we see lockdown, and then at the end of that period, a gradual relaxation with domestic markets opening first. We've already seen the Chinese domestic market open. We would expect, on the assumption that the COVID-19 is successfully contained at that point, allowing some relaxation of restrictions on domestic travel. But on international markets, we would expect to see a more gradual opening through the second half of the year.
Great. That's the last question that we have, and we're just about at the hour. So thank you all for joining.